So if a teenager breaks their arm, like on the soccer field or something, we know exactly what to do.
Right.
We get an X-ray, we put a cast on it, everyone signs it with a Sharpie, and we just wait for it to heal.
Right. It's a very visible
Yeah,
process.
exactly. It's a highly visible, easily understood problem. But, what happens when the injury is completely invisible? Like, what happens when the damage is actually occurring inside the very architecture of their developing brain?
Hmm.
And it's just masked by behavior that we usually just write off as normal teen rebellion.
Yeah, that is a critical blind spot for a lot of adults. I mean, we have this cultural script where, slam doors, rolling eyes, testing boundaries. We just see that as a standard rite of passage.
Oh, absolutely. Just typical teenager stuff.
Right. But when you introduce modern substance use into that picture, treating it like a normal developmental milestone becomes incredibly dangerous.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Whether you are a concerned parent tossing and turning at night, or maybe a K-12 educator on the front lines, or really just a lifelong learner fascinated by adolescent psychology and systemic healthcare solutions, you are in the right place today.
Glad you're here with us.
Yeah. Our mission today is to unpack the MentalSpace Adolescent Cannabis Intervention and Support Guide. We're going to basically separate the biological facts from the cultural fiction regarding teen cannabis use. We really need to figure out what the actual warning signs are. And then we'll look at a systemic solution the guide highlights, which is this really cool support infrastructure rolling out in Georgia schools right now.
And, while the biological science we're going to explore is very sobering, the central theme of this guide is genuinely hopeful.
Yeah, it really is.
The data clearly demonstrates that the most powerful intervention tool isn't like a zero-tolerance policy or getting into a screaming match. It's actually a calm, connected, non-judgmental response.
Strategy over panic. I love that because society still seems to view a teenager smoking weed as like the equivalent of sneaking out to a party. But the source material just completely destroys that comparison.
It really does.
To understand why, you have to think of the adolescent brain like a smartphone. But it isn't a finished phone fresh out of the box. From roughly age 12 to 25, that brain is undergoing a massive foundational operating system update.
Right. It's literally wiring itself for adulthood.
Exactly. And throwing regular cannabis use into that delicate, ongoing process is essentially like injecting corrupted code right in the middle of a vital system installation.
What's fascinating here is the specific mechanism of how that corrupted code actually works. So during adolescence, the brain is actively pruning neural pathways.
Pruning, like a tree.
Yeah, exactly like a tree. It's shedding gray matter it doesn't need and strengthening the connections it actually does. And the final area to fully mature is the prefrontal cortex.
Which is like the decision maker, right?
Yes, it's the CEO of the brain. It governs decision-making, impulse control, empathy, long-term planning. So basically, a teenager has a hyperactive emotional reward center, like an accelerator pedal pushed entirely to the floor. But their prefrontal cortex, the brakes, hasn't been fully installed yet.
Wow. Okay, so when you introduce a chemical like THC regularly into that highly specific environment, it's not just a temporary altered state.
No, not at all. It is a structural disruption. The endocannabinoid system in the brain plays a huge role in that neural pruning process I just mentioned.
So the THC interferes with the pruning.
Exactly. When a teen floods their brain with external cannabinoids from marijuana, it binds to those critical receptors. The guide points to measurable, long-term negative effects on memory retention, sustained attention, and baseline motivation. You're altering the physical architecture of the brain while the cement is still wet.
While the cement is still wet, that is a terrifying image. And the mental health implications are a huge part of that structural alteration, aren't they?
Oh, massively.
Because the sources show a significantly higher risk for developing anxiety and depression. And for vulnerable youth, kids who might already have a genetic predisposition, regular use severely increases the risk of triggering psychosis.
Yes. And this is exactly why the cultural fiction you mentioned earlier is so damaging. We have an entire generation of parents and grandparents looking backward thinking, well, my friends smoked weed in the 1980s, and they turned out fine as accountants and dentists.
Right, the classic, it's just a phase argument.
Exact.
But the guide makes it very clear that historical argument is dead on arrival. We really have to talk about the potency paradox here. Parents are comparing the ditchweed of 1978 to modern, highly engineered chemical ecosystems.
It's completely different.
It really is. The THC concentration in today's products, the legal vapes, the concentrates, the shatter, the edibles, is exponentially higher. We are talking about jumping from a 2 or 3% THC concentration decades ago to upwards of 80 or 90% today.
Yeah, it's the difference between having a glass of weak beer and chugging high-proof grain alcohol.
Oh, wow, yeah. That puts it in perspective.
The mechanism of delivery is faster, the chemical load is massively heavier, and it's hitting a brain that is fundamentally under construction. So, I mean, what stands out to you in considering how differently today's high-potency cannabis interacts with the developing brain compared to, say, 30 years ago? It's really something to reflect on.
Which brings up a really difficult practical question. Okay, let's unpack this, because if I'm playing devil's advocate for a second on behalf of a frustrated parent, I'm looking at the warning signs listed in our sources. Slipping grades, irritability, sleep trouble, secrecy, shifting friend groups.
Right.
I mean, come on, that is just a standard Tuesday for a 15-year-old. How in the world are adults supposed to differentiate between typical adolescent moodiness and a clinical substance issue?
It's a brilliant question because the line can look incredibly blurry. I mean, the key to differentiating typical teenage angst from a serious issue lies in understanding the clinical definition of a cannabis use disorder.
Okay, so what makes it a disorder, officially?
Well, it's not about one bad day, a single moody outburst, or even experimenting once. It is defined by a persistent, compounding pattern of disruption and a fundamental loss of control.
Wait, a loss of control. So the line isn't crossed just by the act of using. The line is crossed when the consequences of using start bleeding into their life and they just keep doing it anyway.
Precisely. A disorder is characterized by a teenager using more of the substance or using it for a much longer period than they intended.
So they might say, oh, I'm only going to do this on weekends.
Right. They might actually tell themselves that, but find they physically and psychologically cannot stick to that rule. You will see repeated, failed efforts to cut down. And the hallmark indicator is continued use despite mounting negative consequences.
Like school or health issues.
Yeah, if their grades are in free fall, if there is severe family conflict every single night, if their physical health is suffering and they still cannot stop, that is compulsion.
That reframes things entirely. The slipping grades aren't just because, like, AP history is difficult. The grades are slipping because the baseline motivation to engage with anything challenging has been chemically blunted.
Exactly.
But what about the secrecy? I mean, teens are biologically programmed to want privacy from their parents, right?
Closing your bedroom door to text your friends is normal privacy. What the guide warns about is active concealment paired with a sudden, unexplainable loss of interest in foundational parts of their identity.
Oh, I see.
If a kid who lived and breathed theater suddenly drops out of the school play, doesn't care, shifts to an entirely new, older friend group, and routinely comes home with chronically red eyes or unusual smells, those aren't isolated quirks. Those are converging data points of concealment.
And the irritability and sleep trouble? Like, if a teenager is just grumpy, how do we know it's actually related to the substance?
The crucial distinction the guide makes is that the irritability, anxiety, or insomnia happens specifically when they are not using. That is the mechanism of withdrawal. Their brain has adapted to the constant presence of high-potency THC to regulate their mood or to initiate sleep. So when the THC isn't there, the system misfires. They cannot self-soothe naturally anymore.
So if the brain is misfiring and creating this profound state of withdrawal, how do you step in as a parent or educator? Because, I mean, discovering this usually triggers a purely emotional reaction.
Of course it does. It's terrifying.
Right. You just want to ground them for a year,
Yeah.
take away their phone, lock them in their room. But here's where it gets really interesting. The source material is emphatic that those draconian, scared straight punishments actually backfire.
They backfire spectacularly. When a teenager feels attacked, cornered, or deeply judged, their already fragile prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline.
The brakes give out completely.
Yes. They enter a state of fight or flight, and they retreat into a defensive posture. You literally cannot logic someone out of a chemical dependency while their brain is screaming that they are under threat.
Which is exactly why the guide insists on a calm, connected, non-judgmental response. You have to keep the lines of communication open so the clinical work can actually happen.
Right.
So what does that clinical work look like? Because this isn't just sitting in a circle singing campfire songs. The guide outlines 4 highly specific, evidence-based treatments.
Yes. The first is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
In the context of adolescent substance use, CBT is about identifying the mechanical triggers of the behavior. Is the trigger social anxiety at parties? Is it academic stress?
Finding the root cause in the moment.
Exactly. Once the therapist helps the teen identify the trigger, CBT teaches them tangible coping skills to manage that specific stressor without reaching for a vape. It physically rewires the behavioral loop.
That makes a lot of sense. You're basically giving them a new script for an old problem. What about the second one, motivational enhancement therapy? Because honestly, that sounds a bit like corporate jargon.
Yeah, it does sound a bit clinical, but the mechanism is fascinating. Think of it like highly specialized coaching. Teenagers naturally resist authority. If an adult says, you must stop smoking weed, the teen's instinct is to dig their heels in.
Oh, for sure.
Motivational enhancement therapy sidesteps that power struggle entirely. The therapist doesn't dictate. Instead, they help the teen explore their own ambivalence.
Like how? What kind of questions do they ask?
They might ask, well, how does smoking every morning align with your goal of getting your driver's license or making the varsity track team? It guides the teen to find their own internal motivation for sobriety, which is infinitely more powerful than external compliance.
Wow, giving them the agency to realize the behavior is sabotaging their own goals. That is brilliant. And the guide also mentions family therapy. I assume that's because treating the teenager in a vacuum doesn't really work if they're just returning to a chaotic environment.
Exactly. Family therapy focuses on repairing the environmental ecosystem. Substance use disorders often severely damage communication between parents and teens. Therapy helps parents learn how to establish boundaries without triggering that fight or flight response we talked about.
So it changes the dynamic.
Yeah, it turns the family unit from a source of conflict into a structured support system.
And the final evidence-based treatment listed is contingency management, which, again, sounds like a very dry clinical term.
The name is dry, but the execution relies heavily on how the adolescent brain is wired. We know the teen brain has a hyperactive reward center.
Right, the accelerator pedal.
Exactly. Contingency management leverages that by providing immediate, tangible rewards for positive behaviors, like passing a drug screen or actively participating in a therapy session.
Wait, really? You reward them for going to therapy?
Yes. It essentially gives the brain a competing hit of healthy dopamine to override the chemical craving. Over time, that immediate reinforcement trains the brain to value sobriety.
It is an incredibly robust toolkit, but, reading through these sources, a massive, glaring, practical hurdle immediately jumps out.
The access problem.
Yes, knowing that CBT and contingency management exist is wonderful, but the reality of the current mental health system is frankly grim. We are talking about months-long wait lists just to get an intake appointment, therapists who don't take insurance, and just crushing out-of-pocket medical bills.
There's a huge barrier.
How on earth do K-12 schools and panicked parents actually get these evidence-based therapies to a kid who is actively spiraling today?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that bottleneck is exactly the systemic crisis the MentalSpace school model is trying to solve. The guide highlights MentalSpace as a case study for how to bypass the traditional broken mental health labyrinth.
And there is a real-world clock ticking on this, too. The source material specifically mentions that MentalSpace provides support for Georgia schools to comply with something called HB 268. And checking the calendar, today is June 4th, 2026. The deadline for that compliance is literally next month, July 2026.
It's coming up fast.
What exactly does that bill mandate?
HB 268 essentially recognizes that schools cannot just be academic institutions anymore. They have to provide a baseline mental health infrastructure for their students. It mandates a safety net.
Right.
MentalSpace acts as that comprehensive infrastructure, integrating directly into the Georgia school system. Instead of a parent calling 20 clinics and getting 20 voicemails, MentalSpace assigns dedicated licensed therapist teams to specific schools.
And the guide says they offer same-day teletherapy, which is, that's unheard of. If a kid has a crisis on a Tuesday morning, and they're speaking to a licensed professional by Tuesday afternoon.
Exactly. It removes the waiting period where a teenager might otherwise fall through the cracks. And they provide holistic net crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, family counseling, and crucially, staff wellness.
Oh, that's huge. Teachers need that.
Yeah, teachers are burning out at unprecedented rates, and a burnout educator cannot be that calm, connected presence a struggling student needs.
Now, whenever you merge healthcare with the public school system, two massive red flags usually pop up for parents, right? Privacy and cost. So let's talk about privacy first. If a kid is receiving substance use counseling during the school day, parents are naturally going to worry that this goes on their permanent academic record.
Which is exactly why the guide explicitly notes that the MentalSpace model is fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant.
Meaning what in plain English?
To put that in plain English, FERPA protects a student's educational records, and HIPAA protects their medical records. The therapy sessions are strictly confidential medical data. They are kept completely siloed from a student's report card or disciplinary file. It is a safe space, legally and practically.
Okay, that covers the privacy. But the second hurdle is the cost. Comprehensive same-day, culturally competent teletherapy sounds wildly expensive. How are families avoiding the financial gatekeeping that usually stops them from getting help?
The mechanism of their accessibility is actually quite clever. They haven't just created a premium service for wealthy districts. For families on Medicaid, the out-of-pocket cost is exactly $0.
Completely fully covered.
Yes, $0. And for families with private insurance, they have negotiated in-network coverage with almost every major provider in the state.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, from Blue Cross to Cigna, Aetna, UHC, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup. By casting a massive net over private insurers and utilizing Medicaid to cover the gaps, they effectively remove the financial barrier to entry. A school counselor can recommend intervention without worrying if the family will go bankrupt paying for it.
And looking at the data presented in the guide, this systemic approach actually yields results. It's not just theory. The schools using the MentalSpace model report an 89% improvement in student attendance.
That's huge.
Yeah, they see a 92% reduction in reported student anxiety. And perhaps most tellingly, an 85% satisfaction rate from the families involved.
It demonstrates that when you remove the barriers of wait times and cost, and you implement evidence-based therapies rather than punishments, you can actually change the trajectory of a teenager's life.
So what does this all mean? If we trace the entire arc of what we've unpacked today, we started with the stark biological reality of the adolescent brain. We saw how this vulnerable operating system, which is actively wiring itself for the future, is uniquely susceptible to the corrupted code of high-potency cannabis.
Right.
We learned how to spot the genuine warning signs of cannabis use disorder, looking for the clinical loss of control, the active concealment, and the chemical misfires of withdrawal, rather than just writing it off as normal teen angst. We explored the deep mechanics of evidence-based treatments like CBT and motivational enhancement therapy, understanding exactly how they rewire triggers and give teens agency. And finally, we saw how the MentalSpace school model is tearing down the traditional financial and systemic barriers to make this care immediate and accessible for K-12 schools across Georgia ahead of the HB 268 mandate.
It represents a fundamental paradigm shift. We are moving away from an outdated model that relied on fear, punishment, and stigma, and moving toward a model rooted in neurobiology, structured support, and immediate accessibility.
And as the guide points out, if you're an administrator scrambling to meet that compliance deadline or a parent who recognizes these patterns of disruption and wants to utilize this resource, their infrastructure is active right now. The contact information provided in the source material is mentalspaceschool.com, or you can reach their teams directly via email at mentalspaceschool@jgtherapy.com.
This raises an important question, though, as we step back and look at the big picture. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at the undeniable data. When a teenager is struggling with something as neurologically severe and legally complex as a dependency on high-potency cannabis, the absolute most powerful, scientifically validated tool we have is a calm, connected, non-judgmental response.
Right.
So if we know that radical empathy is the key to unlocking behavior change in a crisis of that magnitude, how might we apply that exact same radical empathy to the other areas where our teenagers are silently struggling?
Oh, yeah.
What would happen if we approached academic burnout, social anxiety, or digital overload, not with frustration and demands, but with that same structured, non-judgmental support?
That is a phenomenal thought to leave on, because the X-ray machine might not work on the invisible injuries of adolescent brain development, and the cultural scripts we rely on might be terribly out of date. But our ability to stay calm, to foster connection, and to guide them through the overwhelming noise of growing up, that is a mechanism that never loses its potency. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you on the next one.